let's talk about the premiers of Canada's provinces, going from the Pacific coast to the Atlantic coast, mentioning who they are and what they've done in office. Remember, the purpose of this video is not to partisanly promote any one premier, but instead to highlight their actions and help people learn more about them. So let's dive right in. First, we start with the westernmost province of British Columbia, also known as BC, with their premier John Horgan, who has been in office since 2017. He is the leader of the BC New Democratic Party on the social democratic left of the political spectrum. He is currently Canada's only New Democratic premier. Interestingly, his party isn't actually in first place in terms of seats in BC's Legislative Assembly, and he was not elected to be premier. Instead, the Liberal Party of BC received 43 seats, his NDP party received 41 seats, and the Green Party got 3 seats in the Assembly. Horgan was able to take advantage of this, and by partnering up with the Green Party caucus, he was able to kick out the Liberal Premier Christy Clark through a vote of no confidence, making himself the Premier through an extremely narrow majority coalition, which had one more seat than the Liberals. Although, sometimes having to keep this slim majority takes quite a lot of effort from the government, at the expense of major initiatives that the government would actually like to pass, meaning that the Horgan administration isn't as well known for its actions, but instead, it's best known around Canada for its opposition to a major project. Both the NDP and the Green Party of British Columbia are anti-pipeline, and specifically oppose the Trans Mountain pipeline that the government of neighboring Alberta and the federal government of Canada want to build, so that Albertan oil can get access to Pacific markets. Without the cooperation of the British Columbian government, the project has been quite a slog, dragging on for several years without any major construction, leading to Kinder Morgan, the company which owned the pipeline, deciding to sell it. So the government of Canada had to buy it for several billions of dollars, leading to more bureaucracy and expenses. As a result of this, Horgan has become quite a polarizing political figure across Canada. Some people love him, some people hate him. Someone who doesn't really like him, though, would be the premier of the next province. Alberta Premier Jason Kenney defeated former New Democratic Premier Rachel Notley in a landslide 2019 election, when Kenney's United Conservative Party of Alberta swept into power on a pro-oil jobs creation economic reform political campaign. Alberta being Canada's most oil-centered province, what Kenney was proposing seemed favorable to a large chunk of the population. It also helped that the United Conservative Party, also known as the UCP, was a merged organization. Many political scientists argue that the Conservatives had lost to the NDP in 2015, since both the Progressive Conservative and Wildrose parties were competing for Conservative votes. So prior to 2019, they had a merger, and Kenney was elected leader of the new UCP. Since taking power, Kenney has acted to repeal Alberta's carbon tax, declaring his support for green technology to reduce carbon emissions instead, additionally filing a case against the federal government of Canada, which attempted to impose the national carbon tax on Alberta. Kenney also created Alberta's Energy War Room, with the statement that it would fight misinformation related to oil and gas. That's an exact quote. Following the 2019 Canadian federal election, there were quite a few complaints in Alberta as well about the lack of representation in the Liberal national government, since there are no Liberal MPs from Alberta, leading to the creation of the Alberta Independence Party, which is polling at around 5% of the vote. Kenney made a statement that he opposes Albertan secession and created the Fair Deal panel a few weeks after the federal election to address concerns related to representation in the government. Additionally, Kenney has also worked towards balancing Alberta's budgetary deficit, attempting to return to a government surplus within the next few years. Next up, Saskatchewan Premier Scott Moe has had a sort of similar time as Premier Jason Kenney, although he was elected differently compared to Kenney. The former Saskatchewan Premier Brad Wall had announced in 2017 that he wanted to retire from politics, and that the new leader of the Saskatchewan Party elected to replace him would become the premier. Moe won the party leadership in the 5th round of voting and was inaugurated premier of a majority government. For those who may not know, the Saskatchewan Party is a right-leaning conservative party found only in Saskatchewan. His first acts as premier were to increase the education and health funding, while also declaring that Saskatchewan opposes the federal carbon tax implemented by Liberal Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, joining with Alberta and a few other provinces in a lawsuit against the Government of Canada. He also worked alongside Alberta to create Turn Off the Taps legislation against British Columbia, which would allow them to stop giving BC any oil until they approved the Trans Mountain Pipeline. These actions all leading up to the 2020 Saskatchewan provincial election, when he won 78% of the seats in Saskatchewan's Legislative Assembly. Next up, Manitoba Premier Brian Pallister was elected in the 2016 Manitoba general election with a majority of 40 out of 57 seats in the Legislative Assembly, going to Pallister's Progressive Conservative Party. Brian Pallister had run quite a similar government to conservative-leaning premiers Jason Kenney and Scott Moe, generally focusing on economic growth and job creation, broadly lower taxes for businesses and individuals across the province. He has also taken up the cause of decreasing public health waiting times through investment in the healthcare system. Pallister is also another one of the premiers currently suing the federal government against the carbon tax imposed by the Trudeau administration, siding with the Federal Conservative Party of Canada to prioritize green technology rather than the carbon tax, similar to the next name on this list. Progressive Conservative Premier of Ontario, Doug Ford, the head of the largest province in Canada, was elected in 2018 on a landslide election against the Liberal Wynne administration, which had grown extremely unpopular over its last few years. The Liberals went from 55 seats in provincial parliament to 7, whereas Ford's PC party increased from 27 to 76 seats. Once elected, Ford focused on economic improvement and balancing the government budget, whose deficit to GDP ratio had become one of the worst of any national subdivision in the world. Although the process of balancing the budget can be quite a controversial one, the government had an extended standoff with the province's teachers' unions when attempting to decrease the education budget, which eventually led to a series of rotating strikes for teachers that significantly decreased Ford's approval rating to the high 20s. But the provincial government negotiated with the unions and came to an agreement after a few months. His approval rating had recovered slightly to the mid-30s, but what helped him a lot was his government's response to a certain microorganism going around, whose name will get me demonetized on YouTube, so I'll call it the current situation. His response to the current situation is argued to be one of the best in Canada, according to many political experts, which led to his approval rating skyrocketing from 34% to 69% in the polls. He has also engaged in a variety of other initiatives, including a reduction of small business taxes, a significant decrease of taxes for minimum wage earners, firing and replacing the board of directors of Hydro One Electricity to focus on decreasing electricity bills, as well as joining the lawsuit against the federal government's carbon tax. Yet, The next premier might not agree with Ford's stance on the carbon tax. Quebec Premier François Legault is the leader of a Quebec-specific party known as the Coalition Avenir Québec, which was created just in 2011. It's sort of like Quebec's Conservative Party, but not really. It's economically slightly liberal, socially it's conservative, and it's also heavily nationalist. This is Quebec nationalism we're talking about. And it's not directly affiliated with any federal party, including the Bloc Québécois, which is the Quebec Interests Party. After two elections in 2012 and 2014, where the CAQ came in third place, it completely dominated the competition in the 2018 election, getting about 60% of the seats among four major parties. Since being elected, Legault has implemented Quebec Bill 21, which prevents public service employees from wearing any religious symbols while working, has decreased the number of immigrants, and introduced value tests for immigrants, and more. Both in Quebec and across Canada, Legault has a reputation as one of, if not the most controversial premier in Canada, and all of the major federal parties, except for the Bloc Québécois, have stated that they oppose at least some of his actions. But he still holds significant popularity in rural and suburban regions of Quebec, where he polls very highly. But for the moment, let's move on to someone a little less controversial. Progressive Conservative Premier of New Brunswick, Blaine Higgs, won the 2018 provincial election by a one-seat margin over the Liberal Party of New Brunswick. But he didn't win a majority, since two smaller parties, the Green Party and People's Alliance, also won 3 seats each. Since the Green Party formed a coalition with the Liberals, he decided to form an informal coalition with the more conservative People's Alliance, and work with their party's leader, Chris Austin. His main priorities have been opening up opportunities for shale extraction off the province's coast, he balanced the budget, and more. He initially joined the lawsuit against the carbon tax, but backed out when the federal Liberal Party won the popular vote in New Brunswick. Moving on to the next premier, we have Liberal Premier Stephen McNeil, who won the 2013 provincial election of Nova Scotia with 33 out of 51 seats in provincial parliament, followed by re-election in the 2017 election when he won 27 out of 51 seats. During his time as premier, he opened up the electricity market to more private companies, banned fracking for oil in the province, and did a nurses' strike in the healthcare sector, and a bunch more. Although his government has been accused of nepotism on occasion, since many of his former Liberal members of provincial parliament have moved on to powerful public service positions under the administration of the premier. Next up is Progressive Conservative Premier of Prince Edward Island, Blaine Higgs, who won during the 2019 provincial election, in which he got a minority government with 13 out of 27 seats in the provincial parliament. He has taken up policies similar to New Brunswick Premier Blaine Higgs, focusing on a broadly conservative agenda. Despite being a progressive conservative premier, he has not opposed the federal carbon tax, potentially since the official opposition in PEI is the Green Party, which heavily supports it. Now, for Liberal Premier of Newfoundland and Labrador, Dwight, who should not be Premier. Before you ask, that's not me being partisan. It's a fact, since he actually resigned a few months ago. He was caught in a scandal giving government contracts to his supporters, and was kicked out of the Newfoundland and Labrador Liberal Party. The only reason he's still Premier is because of the current situation with the microorganism, and that people can't be going outside to vote for his replacement in large numbers, meaning that he's still technically premier until then. He was initially elected in 2015 with 31 out of 40 seats in provincial parliament, but soon after he reached the lowest popularity of any Canadian premier, specifically a 17% approval rating. And given the current situation, Newfoundland and Labrador was also the first province to announce that it officially ran out of money, and that it had to be bailed out by the Bank of Canada, which gave them $2 billion. Otherwise, they would have declared bankruptcy. So things aren't going that well for Dwight Ball, although I'm curious to see who the next premier of Newfoundland and Labrador will be. Maybe a video for another day. But hey, if you enjoyed this video, please consider liking and subscribing. The buttons are just down there by the description. Oh, also, while I'm speaking about the description, here are some further readings about the premiers in the description that you can look at if you're interested in the topic. Have a great day. Bye!